Hi, everybody. It's the Plant-Based Business Hour. I'm Elysabeth Alfano. Great to be with you here today. I want to welcome also the VegTech Invest LinkedIn followers. This conversation is going to re-air on January 3rd on our LinkedIn VegTech Invest page. But for now, we are live on the Plant-Based Business Hour. I've been waiting for this interview all year. So many questions about where is plant-based going? Is it a fad? Is it a trend? Did everybody get the numbers wrong? Are we still on track? Will it grow? Is there only one company? Beyond Meat and no one else? I mean, what exactly are we talking about? Don't take it from me. Let me bring on my guest today, the senior analyst at Bloomberg, Jen Bartashus. She covers big box retail, consumer packaged goods in food, and just general food trends. Jen, thanks for being with me.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'm so happy to be here.
So you and I have had so many conversations. We've talked about trends. Where is it going? What's the data? I want to level set because, folks on the Plant-Based Business Hour, they do a deep dive, but maybe folks on VegTech Invest, they don't quite yet know. So let's set the record straight for everybody. Is plant-based innovation and alternative proteins, is it a fad or is it a trend? And if it is a trend ongoing, you did a groundbreaking report in August of 2021 saying that the plant-based innovation and alternative protein sector would get to 160 billion by 2030. Are we still on track?
So there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm very happy to talk about this because a lot of people asked this question 2 years ago: is this a fad or is this a trend? And we've maintained from the very beginning that this is a trend. This is something that is not going to go away. But admittedly, the last 2 years have been a hiccup in the road. We've seen sales slow, inflation has taken off, consumers have shifted their spending. And so it's easier today for people to think it's a fad, but we still don't think so. So when we wrote our report, we expected to get to $166 billion in sales in a combination of alternative meats, dairy, products across on a global scale by 2030. Earlier this year, we scaled that. We revised that a little bit to be about 166 billion by 2031. We pushed it out by a year. But as we sit here close to the end of 2022, and because we've had 2 consecutive years of softer sales, we now think that we're still going to reach that type of level, but we're probably talking now in the 2033 to 2034 range, because it will take some time for us to recapture some of the growth speed that we had prior to the pandemic.
Okay, so that's great intel to have. Are you going to reissue a report, or that's just, okay, you will?
We will. So we want to make sure we get the data for the full year. And then once we get a sense of really where 2022 ended up, then we're going to readjust our forecast and take a hard look at what do the trends of the last year and a half to 2 years really mean, and where do we see relief in sight, and where is that pivot point going to come where we start to see greater enthusiasm around the sector. From an investor perspective again.
Yeah, so much to unpack there. So some of the things that have been tricky for me to wrap my mind around is, and this is more the sort of press du jour, not really looking at trends, but more trying to get those clicks in a certain article. A lot has been compared to the year of 2020, which was an aberrational year by every account. Yes. So usually when you have a benchmark, for those maybe who aren't in finance, we'll go over that a little bit. So if you have a benchmark, you want to compare your years to a normal year, not a freaky, aberrational, never to be repeated kind of year. So I think any sector, be it food or not, compared to 2020, is going to be a strange, not normal benchmark. So when you look at your trends, will you be just looking at 2020 as like a blip on the screen, or how will you do that?
Yeah, we definitely think about 2020 as a blip because it forced an evolution in the plant-based space that was way faster than anybody was prepared for. It was faster than consumers were prepared for. It was faster than manufacturers were prepared for. And by pulling forward so much, it created growing pains that we would have seen happen on a natural cadence and consolidated them all into a year. And so when you look back, there was a huge rate of growth during the pandemic, but there were a lot of things that contributed to that. Yes, people were eating at home, but also, if you remember, there was a period in late April, in May, in June, where meat manufacturing companies couldn't stay open because their employees were out with COVID. And so there was a huge spike that happened in terms of meat prices that went through the roof, and it pushed a lot of people into alternative proteins, just from an economic perspective as well as an experimentation perspective. But that was never going to become the new base, and that's what's been tricky, is that it was a spike, it came back down, and now it's a question of, like, well, what's a reasonable level? And so we tend to look at things on a multi-year basis, right? So, we look at 2019, we look at where the growth was, we look at 2020, take it with a grain of salt. We look at 2021, which then was the inverse of 2020, because you had a huge spike in 2020, and then you had a corresponding dip in 2021 when you look at data on a year versus year comparison. And then 2022 had a whole new set of challenges with inflation. So, so we try to take the longer view and sort of say, what would a reasonable average be, and where does the industry stand today versus where it normally ought to have been in a regular type of environment.
This is tricky business because you almost really don't have a control year, because
Right.
2020, 2021, 2022 have all been odd years in their own right. Now, if memory serves, when I look at the data from 2019 and extrapolating out to 2021 and I believe 2022, but I haven't looked at it in a while now, I still see growth. If I don't focus on 2020, but I just look at that line from 2019, I still see growth. Are you, spoiler alert, are you sort of seeing the same?
Yes, we are seeing growth. And it's people get caught up in the headlines of, that demand is down or sales are down. But there's a natural ebb and flow to the way any new sector develops. And that's part of what we're seeing with plant-based. There are going to be highs, there are going to be some glitches, because it is a young industry and it's a new industry and it is going through growing pains. So it's very important to take that long view, and understand, that this is still a very young industry that is growing, and it will continue to grow. And that's why ultimately we're still very positive on the long-term potential for this industry, and why we don't think it's a fad, and why we do think this really is a long-term trend.
So when you look at your numbers, are you taking into account at all what external pressures are going to push the global food supply system? So let's say the SEC encouraging companies to look at their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions to see where the emissions are really coming all up and down the supply chain. So I see that as a push towards more transparency in the global food supply system. I don't think meat companies will do well there. So you have this more educated consumer base really wanting to know what's happening up and down that supply chain for planetary health as well as their own health and what they're going to eat. Do you look at those kind of external indicators, or do you only look at, which is already a lot, but the inflation and how inputs in the supply chain are costing more, costing less, et cetera?
Well, the primary focus is really what you were just talking about, the inputs and costs in the supply chain. But when you think about catalysts for growth, catalysts are beyond just inputs, right? So one of the big catalysts is, and well, I'm sure we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, is price parity with conventional products. That's a big catalyst. But ESG is another catalyst. It's not quite so easy to put a numerical value on, but it is a catalyst for the industry, because consumers are becoming more aware, and because companies are being pressured to increase their transparency, increase their disclosure, have better action plans. It's no longer quite so, it's not quite as okay as it used to be to set an ESG goal that's 30 years out, right?
What's the point? Yeah.
If you think about it, for a long time, people were setting goals that were 20 or 30 years out. Now we're seeing shorter term goals, and those are things that I think are easier for people to understand, and it holds companies a little bit more accountable. So it's hard to put that into a model, but it is definitely one of the catalysts that we see helping to support the long-term growth of the industry.
And it only grows from there. So there's this pressure on corporations to have better carbon footprints, let's say, and focus a little bit more on the E, also the S, because food security and insecurity both become topics of conversation. But, from the larger corporation, we roll down to the individual who's going to want to know more about their carbon footprint, and carbon pricing, I think, is going to come front of pack. So let's jump into that a little bit. You talked about price parity, how important that's going to be. So first, I'll sort of take a snapshot of where we are, just passing the Thanksgiving sales and things like that. Are you seeing that or that consumers are ditching their brands and trading down for the white label, grocery store white label, or are they staying with brands and paying the price?
Well, we're seeing a little bit of a mix. If you look across the entire grocery store, private label sales are up just over 11% year to date, and that's compared to 2.7% for brands. So a huge difference between private label growth and brand level growth.
Yeah.
But it's concentrated in certain categories, right? There are some categories that are much more prone to private label penetration than others. So a great example is alcohol. People like branded alcohol. They like the brand of beer they drink or the brand of wine. They're not so keen on, the generic version or the store brand version. On the other hand, shredded cheese, most people buy the store brand. There's not as much demand for the Sargentos or the Crafts of the world in terms of branded shredded cheese. So you see variation across the store, but on an aggregate basis, consumers have been shifting into that private label, and that's really a response to inflation. It's a response to their tighter budgets, but that also does not play in the favor of plant-based for the most part.
It does and it doesn't. It doesn't play in the favor of plant-based brands.
Correct.
But the sector, the replacement of animal proteins for planetary health, personal health, or just because you feel like it, because the price is better, it seems to work out there. So when I look at like brand 365 or Trader Joe's, they seem to already have a lot of white label products.
They do, and the retailers are really investing in that, and so we've seen hundreds of new plant-based products come to market each year in the last 2 or 3 years. So the retailers are definitely broadening those portfolios, and they're investing in it, and that accounts for a portion of the growth that we're seeing in the private label and the white label options that you talk about. So it's a case where there's more selection than there has been in the past, but part of that selection is now coming from the retailer as opposed to just the branded products.
And do you see cannibalization, or do you just see general growth? Because you could say, well, they're trading down, but you could also say, hey, people like 365. For them, that's like a vote of confidence, and it's going to grow the sector. What do you think there?
I think that demand when you're in a sector right now, like where plant-based is, where there's still a long runway for growth, all contributors help raise the level, right? And so if you're looking at a specific company or a specific brand, you can really dive into, are they gaining share, are they losing share? But the broader players, when you have retailers adding these products to their portfolios, that just encourages more people to buy. And that's ultimately really good for the growth of the sector long term. It doesn't matter so much if they're buying private label or they're buying a brand, or are they trading from a faux burger to faux sausage or chicken tenders. It's those nuances are interesting, but they're not holding back the overall growth.
Yeah, that's interesting to see, because when I look at big box stores like Walmart, Target, Kroger, these kinds of stores, and Costco even, I see them as building out plant-based real estate, for lack of a better expression. I'm particularly Target and Walmart, and I'm seeing more options at Costco. It's not necessarily a plant-based section, but so I think that does a lot to promote the sector in general. And then every sector for it to be healthy really needs its white label as well as its brand influencer chic version. So I see this as a
Absolutely.
healthy step.
It definitely is, because it puts more products in the reach of more consumers.
Yeah.
And one of the criticisms that's been leveled at the plant-based movement is that it's for niche customers. It's not for everybody. And part of that, again, circling back to the price gap, but part of it has been affordability. And so having a lot of products accessible through private label, all that does is help put the products in reach of more consumers who try it, like it, adopt it, and continue to buy it. And consumers right now are at a place where they're doing deal shopping, right? So if there's a promotion on a branded product, they're likely to try that. But if there's not a promotion going on, then maybe they buy the private label version. Or maybe they just love that private label version. I remember, years ago, the CEO of Kroger was talking about private label, and there are people who don't even realize that some of these private label brands are private label brands. They just think it's a brand, just like any other brand. And that's kind of a marker of a hallmark of success in private label, when consumers don't even consider it as a different version. It's just the brand they love.
So when we talk about price parity, we're really talking about price parity with white label, because there'll always be brands that choose to be more expensive because that's their brand. That's what they bring to the table, if you will. So when do you think we'll see price parity with white label?
I think it's still a ways off.
Uh-huh.
And it's not just price parity with white label, but it's price parity with conventional meats, especially on the meat side, because if your price gap is too big, then unless you have a strong incentive other than your budget, meaning it's a lifestyle choice, or it's a health choice, or it's an environmental choice, it's too easy to retreat to the cheaper protein. And so that price gap needs to narrow, and that will take a little while to do. The price gap between the white label and between some of the branded products isn't as big, because you're talking about the same types of products and the same costs involved with producing those products. So it's a little bit easier to keep that gap a little bit narrower for those.
Yes. So sorry, I should have been more clear. Yes, that was what I was thinking about. Is in many ways, meat to me is already a white label product. I'm talking about animal meat. I mean, I guess there's Tyson and there, but usually when you go to pick up hamburger ground, you have no idea.
That's true.
Literally and figuratively, where the heck? What? First of all, what is this really? We won't get into the conversation here about sort of meat being the OG of processed, but you have no idea what's in a meat ground. But more to our point here is we don't know really who made that, and so I think that, just as you were aptly saying, I think that price parity with white label, plant-based, and commodity just meat grounds, that'll be the tricky thing. And Rethink X, I don't know if you've ever heard of them. They do research studies, for everybody who doesn't know, about adoption curves. So how does mass adoption happen for technology, or let's say in this instance, food, and they see the price parity of production. Now, what people do with their branding can be something else. They can double the price just because it goes with their brand. But price parity in terms of production, they're seeing coming by like 2025.
Yeah.
And then from there, you just, when the price goes down, you have more adoption.
Exactly. And so 2025, since we're almost in 2023, could be a little aggressive. Only in that one of the challenges that we have is that in the plant-based sector, you don't, I mean, aside from the really big companies like the Tysons of the world or the Kellogg's, who have that huge scale and are able to leverage that into their plant-based products, your other companies like a Beyond Meat or an Impossible or Oatly, they're small companies, and so there are growing pains associated with having enough scale to bring your cost of production down to be competitive. And so if you look across the entire industry, I think we will get there. It's just a matter of can the little guys find ways to really streamline their processes so that they can take advantage of their growing scale and then pull that into being able to lower their prices and get more people to buy the product. And that creates that virtual cycle of, of growth for those companies. So when demand is up, you can produce more, you can sell more, and it becomes that cycle that helps keep things driving forward. And that's when you'll start to really meaningfully see a lot of the price gap deteriorate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not for the faint of heart. It's just an
It's
enormous
not.
job, for you think of these brands like Beyond Meat. So you opened the door. I don't know. Should we go there? Beyond
We,
Meat? Do you want to
we,
comment? Go ahead.
I think that Beyond Meat has got a wonderful role in terms of vision and where the world can go. And the same applies to some other companies out there. But at the same time, it is being the only publicly traded alternative pure meat pure play. A lot of eyes are on it, and there have been a lot of missteps that have caused the stock price clearly to drop a lot in the last year and a half. And so one of the challenges is that for investors, if people don't know a lot about the sector and they haven't spent the time to really understand the underlying drivers and the catalysts for growth and what the opportunity is, they look at the one stock that's publicly traded and sometimes pass judgment on the entire sector based on the performance of that one company. And that's a lot of responsibility to put on the shoulders of Ethan Brown and Beyond Meat. But it's sort of the reality. People look at it and they say, oh, there's nothing happening in this sector, and that's just not true. But it is a challenge to overcome. When people talk about Beyond Meat and they talk about investors losing enthusiasm for the stock, that makes it harder for the whole industry as well.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. And, again, poor Ethan Brown, in a way, what an unfair position to be in, or what, maybe, it's fun to be champion, but then you have to champion it. I know one of the things we do with the EATV index, EATVI, is we look at the whole sector, not just the end of the line, which would be consumer packaged goods, but all the way starting with ag tech, every company that is from a B2B standpoint working on shifting that global food supply system for planetary health, for their own health, because they see that there's scrutiny in the supply chains and that big meat companies are going to have trouble defending their carbon footprint. The business opportunity is going to push people to make plant-based options, as well as consumers are demanding them, as well as governments are interested since COVID and food insecurity and these long supply chains that are so fragile, that break, that are causing everyone so much grief. So there's all these business reasons to shift to a smarter food supply system. Ultimately, we are tasked with making more food that is more nutritious, using fewer resources, costing less in a shorter amount of time, creating less damage. So when you've got that kind of mandate for you, you see how inefficient and expensive subsidies keep it from having its true price. You see how expensive meat is, if you want to feed people, if that's your goal. If you want to feed animals, meat's great because we spend most of our crops feeding animals, but that's another discussion for another time.
But what you're talking about with your basket, that's the beauty of this sector, right? Because there is so much opportunity along that entire chain. As you said, whether it's ag tech or whether it's, the technology companies that are creating the means for making these alternative products. There's a lot to be excited about.
Yeah, up and down the supply chain. Again, I'm talking about the index here, the EATVI index, which is a benchmark for the sector, because the plant-based innovation and alternative protein sector is so young and new in the public markets, on the stock market, that it needs a benchmark. So that we were talking about benchmarks earlier, like COVID is not a benchmark year, people. That would be crazy. Well, so the industry always needs a benchmark. And so we've put out an index that's a benchmark. So as you say, we look up and down the supply chain because, when you start to pull apart the inefficient business equation that is meat production, you see we can fix monocropping if we stop only only growing the same crops to feed animals. So then you need better ingredient companies. And you see that, well, that's a business to business that could really grow based on plant-based innovation growing. So lots of exciting companies up and down the supply chain.
Exactly.
But beyond meat, if we could,
Yep.
Again, speaking from the index perspective, maybe it's not really beyond meat per se. It's more just general politics. In food, China plays such a major role. Maybe we could unpack a little bit. I'm getting almost until I'm like, spoiler alert, because at the end I was going to ask you about predictions, but I think inflation, recession, and China, three major things I think that really impact food in general. Care to comment on China first?
Well, I think that there are a couple of things I would talk about with regards to China. The first is, if anyone doesn't take seriously the fact that China is including plant-based in their 5-year plan and that they're investing behind it, if they're not taking that seriously, then you're really missing out on something, because China is obviously a global powerhouse, but they import a lot. They import a lot of protein, they import a lot of other foodstuffs. If they get serious about food security and having domestic sources for so much of their consumption needs, that has the potential to really change trade. And we saw it when we had the swine flu that came through and hit China and devastated their pork herds. We saw exports from the US go through the roof. We saw imports to China rise. But as soon as they started rebuilding their domestic herds, that faded very quickly for farmers here in the US. And so the more that they start investing in becoming self-sufficient and investing in alternative proteins, the more seriously people need to take it and look at what the implications are for the global supply chain, and how it impacts the existing businesses as well as new businesses that are developing, which kind of leads to the second thing, where we see a lot of companies continue to say that their area of expansion is in China. So people are building out marketing teams, they're building out sales teams, they're building out manufacturing facilities in China to try to tap into some of that growth. So I think that the size of the market and the potential for the market is still drawing investment. And you're seeing companies, whether it's Beyond Meat or Oatly or some of these other companies, really looking at China as a growth market that they're investing in. So you need to take that into consideration as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think China has so many reasons to be focusing on independence in its own food supply chain. Right now, China is dependent on us for much of their food. You mentioned that we transport live pigs to China. This is another conversation, but you can't really take a strong trade stance if the person you're trading against controls your food. So, then you add pandemic risk, which we all know is increasing. Epidemiologists say that we're in store for another pandemic, not just the one we're currently in now. They also relate that risk to factory farms. So there's, we haven't slowed down our animal factories, so we're not going to slow down our pandemic risk. So more reason to want to be independent if you're China, but also if you're Europe, if you're Singapore, if you're Israel, Middle East instability. So lots of food concerns and water concerns in the Middle East. You see how countries around the world, not just China, are starting to focus on food independence and not, because if we don't have great trade relations with other countries, you want to make sure you still get your food. So then the war in the Ukraine also underscoring this. So I think this push towards food independence is going to increase the innovation rate for things like precision fermentation, biomass fermentation foods, and cultivated meat. So maybe we should talk about the role of, we were going to talk, let's do a quick note on inflation. I would be remiss if I didn't go back to that. So much to talk about, because we're going to talk about innovation too. It's coming. But inflation, as we round out of 2022 and we head towards 2023, have we had the worst of it?
I think that we're slowly starting to come down, right? So it looks at this point like we may have, hit the peak and they're starting to see the other side. realistically, I don't think you're going to see that reflected at retail until the second half of 2023, though.
Second half, not
So
second quarter, second
no, not
half.
second quarter, second half. And it's really in
Ouch.
that it takes time uh, for for prices to kind of renormalize,
Mm,
but it's also that it's uneven. So there are some crops where the prices have come down, but other crops that haven't come down nearly as quickly. And so for each company, depending on what ingredients it is that they're sourcing, their overall commodity basket cost is probably coming down, but for some companies may be coming down faster than for
I
others.
see.
And so it'll take time until that whole basket sort of comes down a little bit and you start to see that widespread flow back through into retail and prices coming down for consumers. So that's why we're looking at the second half of the year. But we are in addition to just the ingredient costs, we're also seeing relief in packaging. So we're seeing some of the packaging costs starting to come down.
Hmm.
Transportation costs are starting to come
Yeah,
down.
yeah,
So all of
yeah.
those things together help paint a better picture for these companies and where they're going to be able to find some cost relief and then pass that on to consumers as they're able to integrate that.
hmm But markets, as we know, just kind of function on good news and bad news. So even if the
It's true.
consumer doesn't see it till the second half of 2023, the markets might be happy as we anticipate that we'll be getting these kind of numbers in the next
Exactly.
couple of weeks. So if you are a plant-based brand, be it white label or other, and you are trying to capture more market share, what do you think they need to do to go to the next level? So if we had these huge spurts in 2020, we had good growth in 2019, huge growth in 2020, now this kind of destabilizing effect in 2021, 2022, as we all try to get supply chains back together, et cetera. What do you think brands need to do most to grow their business?
So I would say there are two big things that come to mind. The first is innovation, which you kind of touched on, and we can circle back to. But the second is now that we have the worst of the pandemic in our rearview mirror, is rethinking strategies to introduce trial. And so whether
Mm,
that's free samples at the grocery store, whether that's marketing campaigns with a restaurant chain, things that we got away from during the pandemic, it's time to come back to that. I was actually in Costco yesterday, and and I knew they were bringing samples back, but there were samples on the floor, and people were excited to be trying products again. Grocery stores have a long history of doing that, and you have some of these large grocers that have been investing very heavily in improving their fresh products. So whether it's produce, whether it's the shelf life of their fresh products, this is a perfect time for these brands to be partnering with retailers and saying, look, you've been pushing fresh. We have a mission in terms of healthy eating or the profile of our food. How can we collaborate? How can we come up with ideas on meal ideas? How to, like, let's feature your carrots with our protein and give
right.
people some inspiration. We're starting to see promotions come back into stores as well. For a long time, they got really restricted during the pandemic. So finding ways to make it enticing to consumers to do trial. But in order to do that, you have to have good products. And that's where the innovation comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the innovation cycle can't stop. And I think in the last year and a half, we've seen innovation kind of retreat to where it's an iteration of existing products.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's also about where can we go that's new. One of the big criticisms I level at the packaged food industry is that a new flavor of breakfast cereal is not innovation. That's not innovation. That's a flavor.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things that I love about the plant-based industry is that you have visionaries who are leading so many of these companies, and innovation can be truly remarkable. So I think that as we get into 2023, that innovation cycle and, getting people excited about new and differentiated products, and not just an upgrade to the existing product, but new ways to experience and to interact with those products is going to be key.
Well, I love that you say this because I was worried that sampling might never come back. I haven't seen it in any stores yet. So I thought like, oh gosh, that's where you, particularly if you're going to trade up to like a branded product, you really want someone to give it to you for free first before you invest in it. So I was afraid that it wouldn't come back. But I love what you say about taking sampling to new heights now that it's back, these partnerships that might really help with, putting together healthy menu options at home, et cetera. Because a lot of people still look at plant-based and think like, I don't know how to make it, even if it's just a burger that you fry up. And to be a little bit devil's advocate, I have seen some innovations with like just a better burger that I have liked in terms of like reducing saturated fat and even
and
taste.
there is definitely a place for that. You're absolutely right.
But I know what you mean. Like now a more red color or something. I don't know if that right. There's a scale here of what we're talking about.
Right.
But it begs me to ask the question, and this may or may not be your expertise, so you can just kind of tell me. But there's all this talk, and I think it's really coming from kind of the criticism from the meat industry, but there's all this talk about like, oh, the label, it's long, or it has ingredients that I'm not pronouncing or something. And, of course, I'll just kind of level set here. Meat doesn't have to have a label. It's just regulated differently. So it's not that there's nothing in that meat. It's just that they don't have to tell you. But anyway, so do people really want healthy? Everybody assumes they do. But when I go to get a hamburger, be it plant-based or other, and the place says, hey, you can have a side salad or you can have fries,
right.
I always order fries.
So,
I'm not sure. What do you think about this? Do we really need more healthy options?
I think that it's important for people, if brands are positioning themselves as a healthy alternative, then I think that the label plays a bigger role. Right. So, if somebody is out there saying, you can lower your cholesterol, or you can, this is, got, this attribute that will help you, then they have to defend that with a cleaner label. But if you're talking about comfort food, most people retreat to comfort food and they don't care about the calories. When restaurants, first were told they had to start putting calorie counts on everything, people said, "Oh, fast food is dead." No, people will still go buy that, 2,000 calorie burger and add fries to it and not blink twice. But if there's a halo of health, then I think that there are things where the label does make a difference. And so if you're billing that you're lower in saturated fat, that's great. If you're saying that it's a clean product, then you need to have pronounceable ingredients, right? So a lot of it comes down to me, at least, it comes down to how the brand is positioning themselves, and not just the overall brand, but each product in that brand's portfolio can be different, right? So if you're selling, if you're selling burger patties, the expectation for a clean label may be very different than if you're talking about, a beverage product, right? And what the attributes may be of that. So I think it does depend a little bit, but overall, to anyone who talks about, unpronounceable products, I would challenge anyone to say, did you eat a Twinkie when you were a kid?
Right. Yeah. It's amazing how polarizing the health question is, because it has people take an immediate sort of holier than thou perspective, and you think like, so you don't walk into a birthday party and have birthday cake, really?
Right.
Like, so, but people take it very, very seriously while they're munching on their French fries. So it's interesting to watch the debates take place. And to me, all of it only says like there's that much more room in the marketplace, because people will always want comfort foods and they will want healthier foods, and they'll want everything in between. So I don't know if you remember the ice cream called Halo. And
I do.
their big marketing was a serving size was 100 calories versus I
Yep.
think the
And
industry
you
standard
could
was
eat the whole pint, right?
yeah, right. Yes. So is it really healthier for you? No, but they're just sticking to that one attribute that
Yep.
gave them halo, that gave them this health halo, and yet they really didn't have to be healthy. They just had to have something they could hold on to. So
Mhm.
I think innovation, true innovation, and marketing innovation are two different things,
Very true.
but it does lend itself to creativity in the marketing standpoint as well as the food innovation standpoint, which kind of going back to that a little bit,
Yeah.
and maybe we're already getting into predictions of 2023, but do you consider plant-based steak an innovation? Because that's kind of hot now.
It is. I look at it in two ways. On one hand, um, if you're trying to win over people who regularly eat steak, it's a hard sell because the
Mm-hmm.
product's not quite there yet, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's getting there. It's getting better. It's better than it's ever been before. Um, but you're going to have a lot of naysayers who are like, it's not good enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and as with anything, people's negative feedback travels further and
Yeah.
wider than positive feedback.
Yeah.
And so, I think that steak is definitely, something that's there. I think it's not just steak, it's anything that's trying to be muscle mimicking. So,
Yeah.
whether it's chicken breast or fish fillet or a steak, there's that is the next kind of holy grail that companies are going after. And it's a good thing, but it's going to take, I think, a lot of iterations to get to where your average consumer is excited about those products.
Mm-hmm.
Because right now, I think there's some trepidation out there, at least from some of the people that we've spoken to. And steak tips or steak cubes is not the same as a steak in
Right.
people's minds. So it comes again back to marketing and how
Mm-hmm.
you position it. Um, uh, for consumers to accept it and then adopt it and purchase it and do repeat purchases.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I've been thinking about that steak party that I want to throw on Wall Street with martinis, cigars, and steaks, and we're not quite there
Not
yet.
quite there
Not
yet.
quite there, but it's coming, and it's coming, and therein, I mean, we could go from the economic standpoint. Therein lies the job growth, therein
Mhm.
lies the possibilities. So, so many great, fun things to think about. As we, for those of you watching on VegTech Invest, this is a rerun that we did in December, so we haven't quite hit December Christmas data yet, of course, but we did do Thanksgiving. Did that holiday play out like you thought? Any learnings from this recent big holiday?
Yeah, I mean, for the holiday, it was an interesting one because what we saw was we saw a lot of retailers make an effort to hold prices sort of level for
Oh,
consumers,
mhm.
and so we saw a lot of people kind of retreat to that traditional Thanksgiving dinner this year, um, and people were concerned that there would be a shortage of turkeys. That didn't really materialize. If it had, that might have actually been an extra boon for
Mhm.
the plant-based industry, but it
Right.
didn't really materialize. But one of the interesting things that we saw coming out of Thanksgiving was that there's more attention now to having a diverse table. So
Huh.
people have their turkey and their traditional type things, but increasingly people have a plant-based alternative because there are individual family members who are, either vegetarian or vegan or trying to stay away from meat. Um, and so we're starting to see that inclusivity in that typical family meal. I wouldn't say it's replacing the traditional turkey at this point, but
Mhm.
it's earning a place on the table, and that's a longer term trend that we're seeing is still kind of in the beginning stages, but is also very encouraging because people are thinking about, having a mushroom-based, main dish, or some other type of dish available at the same time as what they would normally make.
Mhm. This to me is such a major point. So I'll ask you a point blank question, then we can
Mhm.
dive into it. Do you think the world's going vegan?
Yeah. I think eventually the world will, but I think it's a long ways away.
I don't
You
think
know,
the world's going vegan, and the world doesn't have to go vegan. I think, because ultimately there'll be cultivated meat and people will be
well, true,
eating meat with just without the animal
without the
factories.
animals.
I think what's so important about what you said, where there's this plant-based option, sometimes people call it like the veto vote. There's always somebody in your family who's like, not for me, I won't eat meat. So there's
Yep.
that veto vote. And you can finally tell that person, oh my God, I got you your plant-based thing. It's
Yep.
fine, eat it. So that person represents, about let me rephrase that. That person, along with the person who says, I'm going to cut back for the planet, but they still eat meat. That
Hmm.
person, along with the person who says, my doctor told me I better better be good sometimes. So I'll pull back the meat consumption. So that person, along with all these carnivores who just every once in a while pull back on their meat consumption, that represents 162 billion or 106. Is it 166 or 162?
166.
166 billion by
31.
2033
Well,
or
33,
31 or
31.
30. See, we'll see
Mid
what your
30s.
okay
Yeah.
in the before 2035. Fair
Yeah.
enough.
That's the
So
that's the intent.
that's that's a great business proposition.
It is.
162 billion
And
in the foreseeable future.
yeah, I mean, when we do our forecast, we look at it on a meat alternatives perspective and a dairy alternatives perspective.
Mhm.
And for meat alternatives, our forecast is only that it's going to hit 5% of total protein consumption by that date. And so that's only
Wow.
5%. So if you think about the upside and the long-term potential out of a $1.5 trillion
Yeah.
market, um, there's just tons of room for growth. And when I talk to people who are in the dairy industry or in the meat industry, one of the things I try to say over and over again is that we're talking about 5%. This isn't a threat to your business. This is a complement to your business. And so there's room for everyone. There's room for everyone to play. There's room for people who still want to produce and sell and buy meat. There's people who want to, produce and buy and sell alternative products. There's room for everybody because the market is so big on a global basis. And
The
so
market's so
it's
big.
still a drop in the bucket.
It's the smallest amount, and the market's so big it can incorporate that without feeling any hiccups,
Exactly.
and the market itself is growing.
Yeah.
So just because plant-based is 5% doesn't mean that meat is down 5%. It just
Correct.
means that the overall category is growing, and now part of meat is plant-based meat, and that's 5%, and that represents 162 billion before 2035. So very, very interesting. I know that when I talk to people, they say like, "Oh, I'm not vegan. I just don't eat meat." So, I'm seeing a lot of people who, they wouldn't identify as such, but that meat consumption is scaling back. So
Yep.
it's not an all or nothing, folks. You can have, an option once or twice a week. And that even imagine you have 3 meals a day. Most meals now have meat. So even in the morning, people have breakfast sausages and things. So you have 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. That's 21 meals. If people just had one meal a week that was plant-based, that would be
Mhm.
5%. 2 meals would be a whopping 10%. So it's not a big change to represent big dollars. I think that's
Exactly.
what I'm trying to say. So as we wrap up, we've been talking about sort of circling around our predictions. Is steak gonna come? And but maybe can you give me your top 3 predictions for 2023?
So, I would say right now, as we're looking at it 2023, we're expecting to see sales and volume growth for plant-based to start to recover in the second half.
Okay.
So it'll be a tale of two halves. First half
Mhm.
was going to probably be a little bit like 2022. Second half should get a lot more. We see momentum starting to build as we kind of reset with the industry. So that's one. Second is innovation. And we're really watching innovation carefully because if you've looked at the news or you've heard the news, you've heard about corporate job cuts, right? And so there are a lot of companies that have been laying off parts of their workforce. So it's a question of, the smart innovation, right? Being able to still innovate while still containing your costs as an organization. So that is, something that we're watching very carefully in terms of what we were talking about earlier in types of innovation. But that is going to be a very important part of recovery for the industry. So that's probably the second thing. And in terms of the third, I would say we're really, we're excited about some of these newer companies that have new technologies that are coming along. There's a lot of potential, not just in food, but then starting to get into other consumer areas. If you think about mushrooms and mycelium and like the potential uses and how well it can mimic not just food, it can be used as a base for food products, but also as a base for other types of products. Oftentimes when we think about plant-based, we're very, very focused on the food side, which is a very big part of it. But it's those additional opportunities that are also really exciting, and can get people following the industry and being very excited about that industry.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Again, speaking from the EATV index perspective, we see that supply chain is really building out, getting stronger, having more innovation in the supply chain itself. So
Yeah.
that might be an end food product, but that might be the technology in the middle of that supply chain. That might even be the equipment in the middle of that supply chain, all contributing to the great food shift, as I call it, all contributing to that sustainable shift in our global food supply system. So I really believe in that growth in the supply chain. I really see, like you do, innovate, innovate, innovate. I think you're just going to see more innovations. This is going to spur job growth, hopefully. And I take your lead about the second half of 2023 being more robust than the first half of 2023. Maybe some of those jobs will come back or be repositioned, if you will. And then I think if I really had to call it for a prediction for 2023, I would say that it's deli meats, plant-based deli meats are going to come on the scene everywhere, and that it's going to be an easy trade to your white label deli meat that shouldn't be that much more expensive. And that's going to be like an easy one. And for those who are concerned about labels, remember that the meat industry is the OG of processed foods. They actually made the sector processed meats. And so here, and those are class 1 carcinogens, according to the World Health Organization. Here you can send your kids off to school with some plant-based deli meat, and they're not going to know the difference in taste, but it's a big difference in health, big trade up there. I like to end out each interview with, what do you wish you knew 10 years ago that you know now?
Oh goodness. There are so many things, Elizabeth.
Oh my God, that's really a question for drinks. Okay, sorry.
The older you get, the more you realize.
Oh my word.
That's I think that when I look back for 10 years ago, I just think about all the change that we've seen. I guess on a personal note, I wish I knew then how to embrace change better. And how that could help, just with navigation, whether it's life or whether it's career, whatever it may be. But I look back at 10 years ago and it was very, it was kind of blinders on, and focused ahead. And I'd say that's probably at least for me personally, one of the things that I would wish I had known a little bit better.
I love your response, because so many people think, that there aren't any positives to getting older, and there are some, actually. I mean, not a whole heck of a lot, but there are some. There are some. And so thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. If you're running around and you're having a bad day and things aren't going the way you had hoped they would go, what is it that you say to yourself to get yourself back in the groove?
It's only temporary. It's
Yeah.
only temporary. And tomorrow's a new day. And so I try to start every day with a fresh perspective, pick up on the positives from where I left off and leave the negatives behind. And that's really all any of us can really try to do.
That's so true. On those days, I try to go to bed early so that
That
when I
helps
just say,
too.
I just want that clean slate the next day to come as fast as I can. So I try to go to bed early. My last question for you, but never fear, folks. Jen has agreed to be back at least on a quarterly basis, but really, I'm going to try to get her back on a monthly basis. We won't always do a deep dive like this. It'll be shorter, like 10, 15 minutes, giving the Jen Bartashus snapshot of where plant-based foods are going with the highs and the lows of the month, maybe. So she'll be back for sure. You can count on that.
Absolutely.
But my last question for Jen as we head out the door today, you're running around again, like we said, busy day for you. You don't have time for lunch. What is your go-to snack?
Oh, there's nothing better than peanut butter on apple.
That's my go-to snack. Wait a minute. I love peanut butter and apple. I love it. Are you smooth or crunchy?
I'm a smooth peanut butter girl.
Well, see, so you should be my co-host on this show because I'm a crunchy peanut butter girl. So that would set us up nicely. Jen, you do have a busy life. So I'm so grateful that you chose to spend almost an hour here with us today on the Plant-Based Business Hour and VegTech Invest. I want to thank you for all that you do. Folks, if you don't follow Jen, that would be crazy. Follow her. You're on Twitter, aren't you?
I'm not on Twitter, but I am on LinkedIn.
Okay. Follow her on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. And I want to say thank you to everybody watching us who cares about this sector, either from the investing standpoint or just general knowledge about being healthier for you, the planet, and your wallet. So thank you, everybody, for watching on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. I will see you all next week. And Jen, thank you for all you do.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Stay put, Jen. Everybody else,